This is Capitalize Your Finances, the show representing you, a select group of excited, ready, and fired up listeners seeking to potentially maximize your money moves and get after it. We don't settle for generic advice of always and nevers. Our currency is our intellect, and we constantly seek the logical way of likely creating advantages to potentially maximize wealth for our personal and unique situations. The show brings you this step-by-step framework to capitalize your finances in the aspects of your financial situation, and we strive to explore strategies and ideas to potentially help you capitalize on your financial decisions. We are capitalizers, and this is our show.
Welcome back to Capitalize Your Finances. As always, I'm your host, Christopher A. Panayiotou, the Cap and Capitalize. And today we have a rather unique guest. He is the author of Cheating Death, The New Science of Living Longer and Better. He's a hormone replacement specialist, mine, actually. We've been friends for a little while now. I'm excited to have him on the show and talk about the health side of finance. Dr. Rand, welcome to the show.
I'm happy to be here with my favorite patient.
Yes, yes, you are, my man. Well, and I wanted you to give our listeners a little bit of some history on you, because you haven't been in the medical world forever. And I believe when we first got to know each other, were you in accounting, or you had a background in accounting? So what led you into doing what you're doing today?
Well, yeah, I used to be a CPA back when it was Deloitte, Haskins and Sells. I worked with them. This is a long time ago. I just dated myself, obviously. This is, I think, officially my 9th career, and I got into it just because of passion more than anything else. The short story is I was on a trip across country on I-10 and realized I was about to be a father and said, okay, I really have to settle into what I want to do for a living, because I have some major responsibilities coming along the way here, and I just decided to go for it. So that's what led me to what has always been my passion. I just never really had the gumption to go after it, but I'm certainly glad I did, and never looked back since. Yeah.
Well, and my team doesn't know that I was going to say this, but I actually want to tell our listeners how we came in contact. And it's about as big of a testimonial as you can get. So I want you to buckle up. But for the listeners out there that don't know, I've struggled with.
Wait a minute. Isn't this our time in jail? Isn't that going to affect your SEC ratings or anything like that? I mean, should we disclose this?
No, it totally will not. Okay. Totally will not, man. But no. So for listeners out there that don't know, I've struggled with Crohn's. Not struggled. I've actually conquered Crohn's. I've had it since I was 4. And growing up, I always wanted to be extremely healthy, and I never really got that. And so I remember my sophomore year in high school, I said, screw it. I'm either going to die trying or I'm going to become healthy. And I fell in love with just fitness in general, got into a little bit of powerlifting, and then I got into drug-free bodybuilding. And you got to understand, in the early 2010s, there was this whole stigma of, you never take drugs, or you take drugs, or whatever the case is. And I never judged anyone that decided to, but I told myself I would never get to this point where I would have to depend on some type of drug. And I remember back in early, I think it was 2010 or 2012, somewhere around there, YouTube, of course, is in all of our minds. And Dr. Rand, your videos came up educating people on really just health and wellness, but from an appropriate standpoint, right? Not abusing drugs, just enlightening people on understanding what you need to do to be health-wise successful. And I thought, I'm never going to take testosterone replacement. Like, I'll never need that stuff. But if I ever did, I'd be really thankful to have someone like that in my life. Well, you fast forward till 2020, and I was actually diagnosed with low testosterone, and had a little bump tumor in the head, totally fine. But then I remember thinking to myself, whoa, I am now going to become that person I never thought I was going to. But Dr. Rand, this is where you come into play. I remember about a year and a half later, I finally got on your books. I've been with you for a little over a year now. I have felt better than I have ever felt in my life. So I just wanted to say thank you for saving me in a number of ways before we get really started into the fun stuff.
Well, I'm glad that the journey has ended up bringing us together and you've been successful in using TRT properly. It's a great joy for me, and it's part of the reason why I say this is my final career for sure. I mean, maybe if we can live to 400, they suggest that you'll adopt another one, but I would say it would be an adjunct. Like, I've always wanted to be a physicist, but medicine is so much fun for just that reason. Stories like yours where people just end up feeling better, and the myths, the propaganda is dispelled, and now they're calling it misinformation. But people can live better lives again, and it's a real joy for me, as it has been for you, obviously.
Yes, obviously. Well, and what I want to do is I want to get into your book. And when I read your book, I obviously read it from a financial lens. Obviously, this is a financial podcast. And so I can guarantee you, we're normally not supposed to use that word on a regulated show, but I can guarantee you've never had these questions asked. And so just diving in your introduction, you actually shared vulnerability on how you've cheated death multiple times. And I normally like to ask this question at the end of the show, but since you brought it up at the beginning of your book, how has your health journey shaped your view on capitalizing on your finances?
I've never thought to try and tie that together. I'm not sure what answer or exactly what direction you're headed with this, but for me, as I said just a minute ago, tying the two together, I had a point in my life where I had to decide, okay, what are you going to do for a living? Because you're responsible for a new being coming. And, I wanted to do something that I wanted to enjoy for the rest of my life. So I sat there on that long drive across country on the I-10 and really thought about it. It didn't take long I've always known what I wanted to do deep down, but to decide to make the commitment, I think, was the biggest thing. And, I'd had a lot of experience tying it into what, you referred to, my personal experience. And a lot of it was bad in medicine. A lot of it was good. I wouldn't be standing here if it weren't, at least somewhat good. And I just thought, I have an interest in this. And in hindsight, that they say the universe works in mysterious ways. It makes sense. I've gone through a lot of stuff that helps me, I believe anyway, help patients, because I can speak to it oftentimes directly. So I went through that. And even little things like, the surgeon will say you can't do this, but let me tell you what you can really do. And so, that's, I guess that's how it ties together for me in terms of, leading me down the path into finances. I wanted to do something for a living that wasn't work to me.
Yeah. Well, and the reason why I was so fascinated by that is, when you have moments where you cheat death, okay, pun intended, there's a saying, and I forget who coined it, and I'm probably going to butcher it, but it goes something along the lines of men have two lives and their second life starts when they realize they only have one. And I've learned while talking to people that have cheated death in whatever form that means, not just with finance, but everything in their life shifts almost instantaneously. And it's been interesting watching you and following your career since I started following you in the early 2010s. I didn't know any of this about you in the past, but most people I've seen when they cheat death, it's almost like their midlife crisis happens right then and there, right? Like they were very prudent financially, and then they just go off the rails. But clearly for you, you have doubled and tripled down. And so it's just been inspiring to watch, because I think of a lot of our listeners that will have those moments in their lives. I want you guys to all know that just because you have that doesn't mean you just need to fall off the rails. Like Dr. Rand has, I mean, I don't want to say you're like a cat because I don't like cats, but you have like 9 lives, and every single time you've cheated death, you've just doubled and tripled and quadrupled down on what you're doing. So it's very admirable. Now, I wanted to actually talk about a story about one of your patients, Judy, and her Crohn's disease in the book. And the story, it's really nothing short of miraculous. And, you know, even though I've been super blessed to be in remission for the past decade or so, I know the struggle of autoimmune diseases and what they can do. And so regarding the stem cell research and like the ability to cure Crohn's, as well as just autoimmune diseases, I wanted to ask you in general, how close would you say we are to leaping over the regulatory issues of curing that? But then financially speaking, have you ever wondered what the cost savings would be for autoimmune diseases to be completely eradicated?
Well, of course, wondered, and there's not much wondering. There's just coming up with the details and doing even an envelope calculation would show that there'd be huge savings, to get into the financial part of it. Stem cells, for example, their use in fighting autoimmune diseases versus the cost of fighting the consequences of not doing so and just letting it take its course and using what I call paint by numbers medicine to patch things here and here, sometimes literally in the case of UC. This one to me is a no-brainer. That's actually what got me so excited about it, because there's so many things that can be treated successfully with stem cells, and what is going to become, I think, the new medicine. There's some things out there. For example, when I was a resident and we had a patient with UC on the ward, I fought for probably 6 months while I was there getting something as simple as L-glutamine on the formulary. L-glutamine is an amino acid which repairs tissue, epithelial tissue, columnar tissue as well. And just the addition of something as simple and easy to obtain as over-the-counter as L-glutamine can make a huge difference with ulcerative colitis and Crohn's. And then you add some of the higher level stuff that works more dramatically for the long haul, we'll call it. And these things can be not only treated but cured, I would argue, certainly kept at bay. I have many patients, and one of my favorites is someone who worked for me when I was a single dad. And the long story short is, in 1 year's time with one of our famous HMO organizations, she went from having no issue to stage 4 cancer, which means somebody screwed up somewhere, to be quite frank about it. And they told her she had to have her colon removed, etc. Well, we adopted some of these things we're talking about and more, including a change in diet and actually getting enough rest. She has been cancer-free now, not downgraded from 4 to 3 stage. Cancer-free, and gave birth to her first child, who's now 6 months old. So to me, that's uplifting, to say the least. And again, in keeping with where you're going with this, where we have plenty of opportunity ahead of us to make this disease process a non-issue.
Yeah. Well, and it's inspiring for me, and obviously it hits home in a sensitive way in my life, where I'm fortunate that God's blessed us with a good business where we're able to afford a lot of these things if we need to do anything. But it just pains me, no different than you, when you see these people come in and they're maybe just turning the corner in their life, whether it's financially, their health, mentally, you name it. And the cost of these autoimmune diseases that are dragging these people down, I mean, it can ruin you. It can absolutely ruin you. It's sad. I wanted to ask you, can you first, because I have a couple questions on this topic, but can you briefly explain telomeres to our listeners? Because I want to get into this for a second.
Well, the classic example is they call them epaulets, the ends of a shoelace. And they represent, the best analogy is every time the cell replicates, a little bit of that is lost until at some point enough is lost that the end of the shoelace can then fray. And obviously that, in terms of the analogy, disrupts the ability for the cell to replicate. And when that happens, if a cell cannot replicate, and it gets into more complicated matters, but then we have an issue, can't replicate. But also a lot of times the cell will continue to remain and not work properly. It's called a senesced cell. So there's a couple things that come into play when those telomeres wear out. Now there's a direct correlation or a direct effect there in terms of its using, the end is diminished each time you replicate the cell. That's proven. But there's also a correlation now, we believe, between that minimization of that the end of the shoelace and lifespan. So we worked on ways to develop telomerase. Long story short, the ability to either restore the length in that end of the shoelace or to prevent it from shortening. And again, the idea is that we can lengthen health span that way. The cell will continue to function the way it's supposed to and replicate when need be. And, I'm not sure that we can say definitively now that it is associated, because one of the things that comes up in studying the telomeres is that oftentimes the presence of longer than quote unquote normal telomeres is associated with cancer. And that kind of makes sense when you realize that cancer cells can be immortal as long as the host is still alive. They replicate, I'll call it indiscriminately. They're undifferentiated cells. And so, again, I know I'm digging in a little bit, maybe too much into the weeds here, but
okay.
we believe that telomeres are associated with a longer and better lifespan. And so we're looking for ways that help prevent the loss of the telomere and that shortening at the end so the cell can continue to function, which, does make some sense.
Well, and that's where I wanted to ask you, because when I was reading this, I'm going, okay, totally makes sense the older you get from a important standpoint regarding longevity and kind of dragging out the life. But I was curious for our younger fans, right? Are there unique pieces of value that are different from older people? And then also, is there a point where it's maybe too early to look at telomeres as far as expanding that life?
I'm sure we could argue about a time period at which it would be considered too early. But I believe the argument would largely be inconsequential, and the time eventually agreed upon would be broad, because at some point, things are working well. The argument is as soon as you're born, you start dying, but not necessarily true, because we don't come out ready to go. We develop outside the womb, as you know, and arguably, I think the age we still use is age 26. You stop developing in what we call it a positive direction. You're hardwired at that point, was a term we used to use, and then you start to deteriorate from there. Now, obviously, if and I'm not sure I mentioned this, but in my case, when I started boxing, we used to stand across from one another. We had to hit the bag at the same time. It was an old linen bag, and in Florida where I grew up, it was wet, so it was like hitting bricks. And so, traumatic arthritis developed at age 18. Sorry for the long explanation, but that's just a quick example of, you start deteriorating early depending upon what you do. But in terms of the genetic process that's set up, in other words, to develop into the fully mature human being, and I mean mature physiologically, not necessarily emotionally, at age 26, that's when, you've got to that point where you're now an official mature adult. And at any rate, at that point, you could argue you start deteriorating naturally. And, at that point, I guess you could consider that as a good starting point to be aggressive with preventing that decline.
Capitalizers, this episode is sponsored by the best-selling book, Capitalize Your Finances, the how-to framework that takes you from compoundingly clueless to monetarily magnificent. Regardless of where you're at in your financial life, whether you're just beginning to express interest and commitment to your personal finances, at the pinnacle of your career, winding down into retirement, or thinking about your legacy for future generations, this book walks you through every step of the way so you can succeed on your terms and with your own values and passions guiding you. After reading this book, you will officially have Christopher A. Panayotu, the Cap in Capitalize, in your back pocket, guiding you in detail through every step of the way so that you can take charge of your finances, not the other way around. Head on over to Amazon.com today and start capitalizing your finances to the fullest with this incredible book, Capitalize Your Finances, the how-to financial framework that takes you from compoundingly clueless to monetarily magnificent. And now, back to the episode.
Interesting. Well, and I'm not going to go on a tangent because I could talk to you all day about this, but I could actually argue that 26, at least for guys, I mean, I can't speak for our women listeners, but for guys, you know, in at least in health and fitness for like bodybuilding, a lot of these guys, they're in their prime in their 30s or 40s or occasionally even early 50s. So I again, I'm not an expert in your field, but I'm just thinking out loud, which is very dangerous for our listeners and our compliance people. But there's that trend of 26 being the golden number. I think that's being bucked off a little bit. Now, I wanted to talk diet a little bit with you. So one of your recommendations regarding diet is to find one that fits your age. Now, obviously, there's no one size that fits all. But in general, what would be some things that younger capitalizers would want to look into, as well as the more vintage crowd? You know, a common criticism is that good food is expensive, but is that really indeed the case?
Well, to start right there, no. You can get good quality food, I would argue, well, not necessarily fairly easily, but there's plenty of options for someone who wants to eat well without spending a lot of money. You know, particularly if you're in a position to grow your own vegetables, or, you know, like, and I know there aren't that many, so I don't mean to waste too much time with this, but if you can have, you know, chickens on your own property and that sort of thing, you can get away with a lot. But, shoot, I can remember, speaking of those younger days, where I lived on eggs, cheese, loaves of bread, tuna fish, mayonnaise, and peanut butter and jelly. And, you know, people, yeah, you're laughing, but that's not a bad diet. I mean, obviously you're shorting some veggies there, but
Sure.
That goes back into what you started off this conversation with, which is one size does not fit all. And I think that's important to harp upon more than anything. It's not just about age. And you call them vintage versus, you know, younger. I would say,
you like that?
I like to refer to us as masters athletes rather than younger athletes. But
Okay.
and you don't have to necessarily be an athlete. That's another factor. But, you know, age, where you live, what you do for a living, how much commitment you can give to exercise and rest. So there's so many factors that come into it. But it is definitely doable for, I would argue, anyone. You don't have to go to McDonald's for your food, or that the same price, you know, that you would pay at McDonald's. You can get good quality food elsewhere. And a perfect example of that, honestly, is if you go to Europe, you realize that they don't eat necessarily at Michelin-style restaurants all the time. Michelin-starred, I should say. You can go to, like in France, a boulangerie where you get a loaf of bread or a sandwich there and a nice salad for you know, a very small amount of money, and you can be perfectly healthy with stuff like that. One of the longest lived individuals, she lived to, I want to say this is the one that made it to 117. She lived mainly on eggs. And the reason I bring this up is because people talk about, and of course there's a camp for every type of diet out there, right? But,
Yeah.
You know, everyone's always said, oh, you got to have some vegetables. And in general, I would agree that for most people, including some vegetables in life would be important. But not only did she not speak highly of vegetables, but I think the quote was from her physician, something to the effect of, she eschewed the consumption of vegetables from midlife on, and mainly survived on eggs. So again, it goes back to your original point: one size does not fit all. And for example, if eggs were your choice, the diet that worked for you, that would be pretty cheap relative to some other choices.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I actually wanted to talk about your journey a little bit more, because you've mentioned that you've survived both skin and prostate cancer, if I remember reading that correctly. And just out of curiosity, I know I asked earlier and it was a little bit more broad, but not only your outlook on finances, but just outlook on life. How did your outlook change before your diagnoses as opposed to after?
Well, going back to your earlier comment, I have that written down, the quote that you said you might butcher, which I think you got pretty darn near correct. About your second life, etc. Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually saw that in a coffee shop in Sun Valley, Idaho at one point, and I said, I got to write that down. It's a great one. I don't have the answer you're looking for, because I didn't have, while I have had some of those epiphanies in life, I grew up blessed with a father who is very intelligent, still alive, and still very intelligent and with it, who at the dinner table would grill us with philosophical questions. So from a very early stage, I looked at life from the point of view of, hey, carpe diem. You got one, let's live it. Let's not work on number two. That said, everyone thinks that's what's going on, and your quote, comes into play whether you want it or not. You're like, oh, I thought I was on the right path. But yeah, I've had a few moments like that along the way, despite being sort of trained into that from the beginning. I lost track of your original question, where you were going with this. But having had a few of these things happen to me, it just solidifies that feeling of, hey man, there is no tomorrow. And my philosophy, and you're going to hate this one, but I always say, hey, do you want to live rich or die rich?
Right.
I'd like to make sure that I have enough, to go the distance, and I work hard at doing that. But at the same time, if given the opportunity and I go, wow, this might stretch my budget, I'd much rather go for it now. And oftentimes it's because I think about, hey, you know what? I've had a few where it wasn't just, this could go wrong, but I was on the verge of it going wrong. I have moments in my life, which we don't need to get into, but I remember calling my folks saying, this may be the last time I talk to you. Those aren't pleasant moments, but more to your point, they grab a hold of you and make you realize, hey, let's not waste this. And again, I go back to carpe diem. Yeah.
Well, and I do not cringe at that at all. Okay. About living rich versus dying rich. It's interesting. When I first started in what I do, I was all about the academic side, and, take anything you have left over, invest. I mean, I wrote a book about it, for crying out loud. But as I've gotten, and I'm not old by any means, but I'm a lot older than when I started investing. And as you get to interview a lot of these people that have become incredibly successful, such as yourself, you start to realize that, okay, once you're going to be okay, right, relatively speaking, I'm not saying live a little bit more, but I think people get, they get caught up with the live rich or die rich. My thing is, as long as you live, and our listeners are going to roll their eyes because I say this all the time, but as long as you live as prudently as possible, there is no way you can look back and say, wow, I really screwed the pooch. Because prudency is going to get you from A to Z, whether it's your health, whether it's your finance, your marriage, your relationships, your faith, you name it. Now, I actually wanted to talk about supplementation a little bit with you. And you were listing out all of these supplements that could benefit a person's overall health. And, as I was researching the costs of these, overall, it wasn't tremendously expensive. And so if you could ballpark it, what would you say would be like a good monthly cost for a supplement stack that you would recommend everyday people to have?
That's easy because in my experience, and it's rare that you can say this in medicine and life in general, right? All of the people I have met, unless they're already supplementing, are short in the B vitamins, B as in Bravo, or D3, Delta 3. The B vitamins are considered the stress vitamins. If you remember your high school physiology, you called it we call it the Krebs cycle. You guys called it the citric acid cycle. How we convert food into usable energy, generally speaking. You need all the B vitamins along with coenzyme Q10, zinc, magnesium, some manganese, and some others. But, we've only, we've gone from basically herding sheep 300 years ago to a very stressful environment. And 300 years isn't even a blink in evolution. So we haven't adapted well. We don't store the B vitamins very well. Yet we need them. And so we're typically short on B vitamins. They're easy to supplement in the sense that they're readily available and cheap, going back to your budget. But you'll see if you start taking them, because one of the vitamins, B2, riboflavin, shows up as that sort of yellow-green color in your urine when you take B vitamins, and the excess is urinated out. But that's testament to the fact that you need to take them more because they don't stick to you, okay, like some other vitamins do that we've evolved to hold on to better than the B vitamins. And so that one you can almost take like candy. The B vitamins are so important. Sometimes just taking B vitamins, people notice, they go, wow, how come I haven't been doing this, before? I wish I had known. And then D3, the so-called sun vitamin, which is not a vitamin, it's actually a hormone, a steroid made from cholesterol. Again, we were out all day 300 years ago. Remember we were herding sheep? Nowadays, you mentioned skin cancer. 300 years ago, we were dead by age 30. We weren't worried about malignant melanoma. You didn't live long enough for that. So it was not an issue. Nowadays, I hasten to stop people who say, oh yeah, I'm going to make an effort to raise that, because I check the assays for vitamin D, and typically they're at the bottom or below with just about every individual I run across, even lifeguards, okay, presumably out in the sun for a good portion of the day, because we're just not out. Oh, well, I play golf on the weekends, and, sometimes I'll play 2 rounds, Rand. Okay, great. But as evidenced by your assays being below normal, it's still not enough, right? And, without getting too technical, we're looking at serum rather than cellular levels of vitamin D, but it's still correlated. At any rate, get your vitamin D from a pill. Go out and enjoy the sun as much as you want, but with sunscreen. Those two, if you went out and purchased a month's supply, you're probably talking about $30, $35 a month. The vitamin D is probably the most expensive at 50 cents a day, I would estimate. And the B's cheaper than that. So it really is something that everyone should do, and I do tell that to everybody. You should be doing that, in terms of supplements. Now, in the book, I list all kinds of other ones that are based upon whatever goals you might have. If you want to, God forbid, run a marathon. I say God forbid because unless you're 6 foot and 130 pounds, you probably shouldn't be doing that unless it's absolutely something on your bucket list. And this goes back, to circle back just a tad. I was thinking about doing one of those social media, what do you call it? When I don't want to be presumptuous and say that I'm doing a public service necessarily, but I try and look at it that way. We're talking about,
like a before and
presumption.
After.
Well, no. I'm just saying. I'm just trying not to be presumptuous. I get out there when I think I have something that people want to hear. I hope I am right, but I'm not necessarily so. But so many people who are in the social media game will get out there and presume that what you want to do is what they think is the right thing to do. For example, and this may be getting way off topic, and you can edit it out later, Chris, but
no, that's all right. We're going to keep this running, man.
I don't necessarily want to live forever. And we all, every person I've ever met will certainly say, and I can say every person, they don't want to live forever if it's going to be in poor health, right? So that's an easy one. But I don't necessarily want to live the way everyone says you're supposed to live, which is to, optimize your health 100%. What I mean by that is if I want to go out and have a couple glasses of Pinot Noir, which I consider a great joy in life when paired with the right, meats or whether it's fish or red meat or whatever, then I want to do that. And so much of what's on social media looks at these studies and interprets them based upon the idea that it's supposed to be to last as long as you can in good health. Well, if that were the case, go somewhere where you can sit in a very, very cold environment and don't move much, and that's probably your best effort at living longer without wearing out before you die and having a pristine corpse. You get my point. How ridiculous is that? And so what I enjoy focusing on more than that is, hey, you want to have some Pinot Noir? Here's some ways to compensate perhaps for that. And of course, one of the great compensatory mechanisms is exercise, the great equalizer.
Yep.
And so some of those supplements, bringing it around full circle now, might be to compensate for some of the things that we think are worth enjoying in life as opposed to just living as long as possible in a pristine state.
Yeah. Well, and actually we didn't go off topic at all because, financially speaking, one of the things you mentioned is social media, which again, if I go on that rant, we'll be here all day. And so I'm not going to do that. But what I will say is I'm going to say it ticks me off that a lot of these social media influencers, if you will, they push all of these things in the world of health and finance. Okay. Fitness and finance, they correlate heavily. And what you were just saying about $35 a month for solid vitamin D, vitamin B pills, you didn't get into glucosamine or glutamine or like whey or whatever the case is, but you could list all these things out, and it's not nearly as expensive as people think. And that's something I'm really glad you brought up, because listeners out there, you don't need to be just rolling in the money to have a healthy, fulfilled life. Now, if you live in Santa Monica where Dr. Rand is, you better break the bank somehow, right? Because rent there is pretty expensive. But literally anywhere else, right? You're golden. Now, the criticism in fitness is, nutrition, supplementation. Yes, it's super expensive. We've already discussed the cost, but I wanted to actually go on a much more surface level topic before we wrap things up with you. So my question is this: if you had to limit yourself to a protein, a carb, a fat, a veggie, and a supplement, what would each of those be? And while you're doing that and listing it, I'm going to write down roughly what that is going to cost someone on a monthly basis. So let's start with
that's protein. A fun game.
Yeah,
that's an easy one. I'm a seafood eater, and if I have to pare that down, I would say fish, and probably my favorite is what most people know as mahi. So that would be my choice.
Okay. By the way, I'm just laughing because my brother is going to be cringing at that. Long story short, we have not had mahi in the Paniotu household in quite some time, but that's for off script. So that's the protein. Okay. Now, what's the carb?
Do I get to categorize carbs between starchy carbs and vegetables, or do I have to just stick with
you know what? Carb? Just to make it really easy for you, we're going to make it, we're just going to do just like not getting gray, like a carb's a carb, a veggie's a veggie, right? Let's just make it really easy.
Well, they're both carbs. It's just one's a starchy carb and one is, full of something that mainly has indigestible sugars. But if I can do that, then that's kind of an easy one. I would say my favorite carb is a potato.
Okay.
A starchy carb, I mean. And boy, with vegetables, I probably have to go with, I can luck out on that one because the tomato is actually considered a fruit. So I can push that off to something else. Although, if you're going to give me fruits, divide it up even further. But if not, I'll go with tomato and otherwise probably have to go with spinach. I like spinach a lot.
Okay. Now, what about the fat?
Well, again, we're talking macros here, guys. So remember that all these cross over, right? Because I could have a ribeye and that'd be a really fatty meal with protein.
Yep.
But if I had to pick a fat, boy, that's tough. And now I have to think of combinations too, right? Because if my only carb is potato, it's not a good baguette. Then what use is olive oil? Or it's not as useful. Maybe you go with butter. I know. How about cheese? I love cheese.
Okay, we can do that. Now, as far as the supplement goes, what would be the go-to supplement? I have an idea of what I think you're going to say, but I don't want to say it because then if I assume and it's incorrect.
No, it's obvious. I mean, if we're unless we're excluding the two I mentioned, I mean, B complex is essential.
Okay,
that's a no-brainer. You don't even have to hesitate. Without that, my life would not be as good, and I would argue most people's in this world who are under stress.
So as I'm writing all of this down, okay, so mahi-mahi, now again, Dr. Rand is a little bit more experienced and successful in life, so he's probably not going for the, bottom of the shelf in the back of the Walmart of mahi-mahi, but mahi-mahi is not tremendously expensive on the whole of things, right? So as I'm looking all of this up, it's about $35-ish a month for the B complex. The tomato and spinach, okay, you could say that's about, and again, we're buying in bulk here. We're probably going to Costco, right? Let's say 150-ish a month, and that means, you're eating a ton, right? It's for you and your family. Same thing.
If you're not growing your own, which is really cheap. We had 36 tomato plants last year and had to give away a lot of them. The tomatoes.
That's extreme.
And by the way, the $35 you quoted here, here's my CPA coming out. Remember, that was for D and B both.
Okay.
You could argue that the D, if it's 50 cents a day, that's $15 a month right there. And then the B, man, it's got to be even cheaper than that now that I think about it, right?
Well, as I'm writing all this down, ballparking it. And again, obviously this depends where capitalizers live out there. But if you're trying to get the go-to diet that Dr. Rand would say that he would fall on the sword for, mahi-mahi, potato, cheese, tomato, spinach, and B complex, on a monthly basis, you're looking at around $440 to $550, depending on obviously where you live. And I'll tell you,
and that's going to be because of the fish.
Yeah, it's because of the fish. If you divide all that up just by daily, it is not grotesquely difficult to live a healthy life. And if you choose to go that route and live a healthy life, the finances are going to follow. Now,
well, remember, you pinned me down too, because one of the ways to get great protein that is also one of my favorites, if you don't give me limitations. Remember, I grew up in Florida where we had the Cuban influence, and not just Cuban anymore. I mean, it's South American in general. But you give me some beans and rice and a little bit of hot sauce or something, I am one happy camper. So, and I know a lot of people who are. And you're getting your carbs and your proteins with beans and rice, sufficient for muscle growth and maintenance, I should say, if you're an endurance athlete. So, I mean, there's so many ways to do it, even more cheaply, I would argue, than that.
Sure. Oh, yeah. But again, we've got to live a little, right? We're in the presence of greatness, so I'm trying to round up a little. Now, Dr. Rand, I gotta tell you, man, I've thoroughly enjoyed having you on the show. We're going to have, what we have to do is we have to get you back up to the studio so you can sign the capitalized board. But I want to close this out with giving our listeners, obviously, the path to Dr. Rand. So where can our capitalizers go to best support you in your incredible book, Cheating Death?
Well, for the book, I believe we still have the website called cheatingdeath.com. And we have our own website, which is psrmed.com, Papa Sierra Romeo med.com. And we like to keep a lot of relevant information on that. Obviously, the book is something that requires a purchase, but there's, as you mentioned, thank you, and hope it's helpful. There's a lot of video material out there that's categorized and searchable that's all free. And again, ditto for the website, psrmed.com. So Yeah, I hope that's helpful.
It totally is, Doc. Well, and to you listeners that are still tuning in, thank you so much for listening in to Capitalize Your Finances. For those that are new, welcome to the family. For newbies and veterans, you either know or now will know the drill. If you have any questions about today's episode, either hit me up at my email, chris@capitalizeyourfinances.com, or you can give us a call at 253-214-3050, and I would be happy to answer any questions that pop into your lovely little minds. If you're listening in and you go, good gosh, I would love to be a guest on the show, or I have someone that I think you would love to interview, Cap and Capitalize, head on over to capitalizepodcast.com, shoot us a DM. I read it every single day with my team. As always, I'm your host, Chris Ray Paniotti, the Cap and Capitalize, and until next time, keep capitalizing.
These materials are provided for general information and educational purposes based on publicly available information from sources believed to be reliable. We cannot assure the accuracy or completeness of these materials. Christopher Paniotu is a registered representative with and securities and advisory services offered through LPL Financial, a registered investment advisor, and member FINRA SIPC. The investment professionals are affiliated with LPL Financial and are conducting business using the name Capitalize Your Finances, a separate entity from LPL Financial. Rand McClain and any other individual or company mentioned in this podcast are not affiliated with Capitalize Your Finances or LPL Financial.